All right, gang, howdy. Today's video is going to be addressing the last topic in our second unit, Module 8, Science and Inquiry. And so this is the week of content that's going to be transitioning us into this. Next, we're going to be kind of entertaining this thing called postmodernism, postmodernity. And so this business of the rhetoric of science, I think, it makes sense that this is the kind of the pivot point coming after Perelman, who's all about kind of public rationality and reason and argumentation. And then with Burke, we get into a broader, more expansive, more stylistic, literary, aesthetic kind of a understanding of persuasion and influence. And then, a couple more decades after, Burke's ideas are taking hold, not only because of Burke, because of all kinds of things going on in the world, but this new kind of sub-discipline within the field of rhetoric called the rhetoric of science starts to emerge. And it is now a, self-contained kind of area of rhetoric itself. My colleagues, Dr. Bloomfield and Dr. Gruber, both kind of operate in this part of our discipline. So I have them to thank for this week's readings. I'm going to mostly focus on the Ornatowski piece, Rhetoric of Science, Oxymoron, or Tautology. And then the other piece by Ceccarelli is just a little sampling of like public, Ceccarelli is a major rhetorical critic and scholar who also tries to kind of send stuff out into the public. This is a little bit of that effort. And, she's talking about science and publicness, and so she's trying to do that in the public, and that itself is a kind of model of the things she's talking about. But, we'll just look at that one briefly. It's just a kind of little interesting example. But the stuff in the Ornatowski piece is really good, and it covers a good amount of ground in a fairly short amount of time, and I'm just going to hit some of the key stuff here. The first thing, so this topic, rhetoric and science, or rhetoric of science, is massive, and I could go on for so long, and I'm not even a rhetoric of science scholar, but, these issues between, they're kind of philosophical, right? Rhetoric is about appearances, and it's about kind of how it is that we use our kind of technical skills to try to impact and move one another, essentially. Whereas science, the way we talk about science and the way we sometimes kind of hold it up to this high level is supposed to be a very neutral, objective, just a search for the truth. And then once the truths are found, that's that, right? The end. Ricky Gervais is famous for saying he's always trashing on religion, and whenever people challenge him on this, he says, if you got rid of all the religious works that have ever been written, we wouldn't necessarily know the difference, right? We wouldn't miss them. We wouldn't know the difference. Chances are weird, different new religions would replace them. But the works of science, if you got rid of all the science books, then eventually over time we would rewrite those same books. The point is fair, but also you can imagine maybe not those exact books or those books written in the exact same way. And into that little kind of gap or that questioning would the rhetoric of science people come in. The first thing I think we need to say is to talk about the rhetoric of science is not to say that science is made up or fictional or fantastical or a lie or false or whatever, right? We are not saying that those who study the rhetoric of science are arguing that science is completely made up. Now, Ornatowski kind of entertains that more radical position toward the end, and you can, in fact, find people who would say there is no there's no objective reality out there. All we do is create stories. We call them science, but they're really just stories, and so therefore we are all just storytellers and rhetoricians, and some of us wear science hats and some of us wear rhetoric hats, but we're all just rhetoricians, whether we know it or not, right? That's the more extreme view that we're not going to insist on. I'm just going to flag it. It's there, right? And, that's, by the way, if that hasn't already occurred to you, that's a very sophistic and Gorgianic conception. I actually wrote Protagoras at one point in the column there. I don't know if you remember, Protagoras says, it's attributed to him, nothing exists. I think I talked about this in an earlier video. If anything exists, we couldn't know it. And even if we could know anything that exists, we wouldn't be able to communicate it, right? So this is a radically kind of skeptical view of what's out there. We can never know for sure, right? So he would fall on that kind of more radical camp in terms of all we do as scientists is kind of make up stories and reports, and maybe some of those are closer to actual reality, maybe some of them are further, we'll never know. It's a very social kind of thing that we're doing. Now, there are those who, on the other extreme, who hate rhetoric, and think about Descartes here maybe, and like Ramus and some like Plato. Like, we want just the hard, objective. Doesn't matter if anyone's looking at it. Doesn't matter if there's interpretation going on. It just is, right? It doesn't matter if humans exist or not. That thing, that reality is, right? And all that science is trying to do is uncover the hard realities, whatever they might be, ugly, beautiful, whatever. It's just that's what it is. And there is an is. There is something outside of us that we can get at with our scientific instruments, and imperfect as they might be, and we can generate our truths of existence, of reality, the laws of nature, the laws of the universe, or whatever. And all that we need to be doing as scientists is working ever harder to get closer and closer and closer to that reality. I mean, we've done incredible things with our scientific technologies and instruments, and we can, the CERN, the Hadron Collider thing that's like miles and miles long. It's this big circle that speeds up quantum material to the speed of whatever the conditions of the Big Bang. Like, we are remarkable in terms of what we've been able to do. We talk about quarks, we have all these theories that, lo and behold, seem to actually kind of bear out in terms of actual real processes, right? And so, it's a tough business, this rhetoric of science business, because on the one hand, we might not ultimately know, right? On the one hand, the one extreme is everything is made up and everything's storytelling. That's the kind of hard rhetoric, sophistic position. On the other extreme is the more like conservatively philosophical, mathematical, kind of hard, cold reason perspective that says there is a universe. It doesn't give a crap about human beings and their interpretations and their subjectivities and their limited brains or whatever. It just is. It just always will be, regardless of us. And so all we're trying to do is get closer and closer to that objective reality. But then these folks over here would say, but we never get closer and closer except by using language and mediums and all this kind of stuff. So this is the kind of the broad strokes of the like debate or tension. And it makes sense that this was happening in the latter part of the 20th century. Again, after we're seeing all kinds of scientific achievements do terrible things, right? So for the first at least half of the 20th century, going back to the 17th century, science, logic, reason, experimentation, formal logic, right? All of these pursuits were thought to be like the very architecture of transcendent knowledge, right? And then, oopsie daisy, we end up doing terrible, terrible things with these things, and we start to realize, like bombs and chemical warfare, and the automobile is wonderful, but oh my goodness, how many people are dying every year from automobiles, or blah, 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 weapons, chemicals, all these new chemicals that make life easier and cleaning and whatever. Oops, now we're ruining our environment, right? It's like, oh my goodness, all of this technology and science isn't necessarily innately, inevitably, perfecting of the human condition. So, all right, that's 10 minutes. So there's big stakes here. And all that we're trying to say in this week of readings is that rhetoricians have been kind of having these debates with the philosophers and the scientists and the mathematicians, almost basically going back to the beginning. I'm thinking about the Gorgias, Plato's dialogue of the Gorgias, where there's this long back and forth between, is it Gorgias and Socrates, or maybe Callicles, and they're talking about, a good rhetor is able to make a patient take their medicine better than a doctor, right? And that's a really interesting thought that, like, a doctor's supposed to know the actual objective truth of someone's medical condition, right? But what if they can't actually communicate that to their patient, or they're really bad at it, right? And so now the patient is all like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do, or I don't know if I believe this person. They seem weird and kooky and whatever. Whereas the slick pharmacist could come along and be like, hey, but this is why you need to take these. It's super important, whatever. That second person might not actually have the knowledge that the first person does, but what good is that first person's knowledge, the doctor, if they can't actually use it and communicate, right? And so these issues go way back to the beginning, and we're kind of still dealing with them. And so the Ornatowski reading is really good in terms of like talking about the big issues and some of the kind of recurrent themes and some of the developments. And I'll try to move quickly here, 10 minutes. All right, so Rhetoric and Science, this changing relationship. The basic kind of at the outset, we want to just note that the scholars of the Rhetoric of Science just insist that science, whatever actual absolute truths it comes up with, cannot ignore the fact that it is also rhetorical in many, many ways. And Cezar goes through and mentions a bunch, right? The fact that there are scientific conventions and conferences, and the fact that there are journals where people publish and then disagree, and even sometimes in heated ways, and, is it Pluto or Saturn or Jupiter? One of the planets. Like, is it a planet? Is it not a planet? We disagree. We have different language for things. So there's a lot of disagreement right there. Should tell you that we're in the world of rhetoric, right? If science were inevitably and inherently kind of perfect, we wouldn't have debates. We wouldn't have disputes. The findings would be released. Our brains would be capable of understanding the perfect truths within them, and then we would say, great, cool, done, the end, right? But the fact that we have debates about vaccines, the fact that we have debates about masks and the efficacy of masks, means that there is this big space of interpretation. Even within the technical and professional realms where this stuff is actually studied and highly technical fields, right? There's debates there. And then there's debates when the technical experts go into the public, and that's the Ceccarelli piece, right? Is like, a couple years back, when I was a grad coordinator for our program, I got involved in the university campus activities in terms of these speeches and presentations, and I was helping coach grad students from across the campus, and I was blown away by, no offense, but how inexperienced and unprepared a lot of the science students were for speaking in public. They speak very quickly, they speak very quietly, they use all kinds of technical language that no one understands, right? So the job was to try to help them not lie or distort or whatever, but just help better communicate their ideas in a simpler, more clean, coherent way, speak to your audience as a group of people who have interests and questions and concerns and are easily distracted, right? So all of this stuff matters in terms of the discoveries of science, and also the publishing and mediation of scientific discoveries. So Ornatowski covers that pretty well in the first couple pages here. Science is a kind of discourse. I like this idea. This is sort of drawing off of Lyotard's notion of language games, right? Whatever field of activity we find ourselves in, we're playing a certain kind of language game, and there's vocabularies, and there's assumptions, and there's certain rules and rituals and codes. Think about the law. Think about the language games and the kind of code that exists in the law, or in the crypto world or whatever, right? Science itself is a kind of language game. Don't be fooled by this word game. It just means that it's a kind of an enterprise that has its own built-in sort of norms and rules and vocabularies and terminology and so on. And that's kind of what he's talking about here. So in the middle of that second page, discourse is typically associated with specific domains or institutionalization. So we can talk about the legal discourse. We can talk about the health discourse. We can talk about on and on and on. And science is one as well, right? So the second last paragraph on that second page before the break, it says, the rhetorical view of science rests at bottom on the premise that science is, after all, not the world itself and not nature itself, but a representation of it. And any representation involves strategies of representation. How do we make our discoveries meaningful to people? That's rhetoric. How do we make them matter? How do we make them clear and accessible? There's been a lot of hatred for Fauci coming out of the pandemic, right? Was it because he was saying things that were wrong or untrue, or were just things that people didn't like to hear? Did they just hate Biden and therefore they hated him? This is all the realm of kind of public interpretation, and we've seen in live, in our own lives, just how like high stakes all of this stuff can be. Because let's face it, that pandemic business, now, how do you do it perfectly, right? But the fact that we had social media and we had so many different opinions out there, right? We're dealing with a public that now has, every individual has their own like little megaphone and their own little device that helps them scrutinize things and publish their opinions. It got so messy, so much interpretation, so many opinions. And it's like at a certain point, what do we even do here, right? So we've been seeing this playing out, and we now see it with Trump. I think he has gone with RFK, right? So this is interesting because RFK has all kinds of problems. This is Robert Kennedy is looking to be Trump's health secretary, which is wild because this is a guy who wants to like upend so many of the assumptions and norms of the health, the health industry, I guess, for so long, right? The fact that science today has become so controversial, and because there's so many weird conspiracies. I just saw a video the other day where some guy is like, he insists on eating only raw meat, and he's putting raw meat in these jars and he's letting it rot, but he calls it fermenting, and he's eating rotting meat that he's cooking in these jars, just cutting up meat and putting them in jars and letting it rot, and convincing himself that this is like raw and real and healthy and raw milk. And I understand the rejection of the experts because we don't like some of the bad calls that have been made. There's just this wild amount of distrust in experts right now, and it's cascading in very strange ways in terms of like doing things in traditional ways, but maybe there are good reasons for some of the ways we've doing. So we're in this moment of everything's kind of up in the air, right? All right, so rhetoric and epistemology is basically this notion that rhetoric is involved in knowledge, in the creation of knowledge, in the dissemination of knowledge. Ideas themselves, the argument here is basically our ideas are themselves rhetorical. They come into our brains from other sources, oftentimes from maybe partial sources or fallible sources. We generate new ideas. They are also partial and fallible, right? And yet that's how it happens. So rhetoric is tied to knowledge, even scientific knowledge, even technical knowledge. We could talk about the rhetoric of computer programming. We can talk about the rhetoric of math and math books, and how do you get people excited about math, and why are we doing math differently today than we did it before, and on and on and on, right? It's all low-level rhetoric, at least low-level rhetoric, in the sense that these are human, textual creations. He talks about inscriptions here on this third page. So let's get into that a little bit, actually. He talks about the different ways that rhetoric is involved in knowledge. So this business of inscriptions, we're talking about notes, we're talking about records and diaries. Today we have now like YouTube channels, and we could call that inscription as well. We have all these recordings and these documentations of the processes of scientific discovery, including these kooky videos about eating, raw meat and all that, right? That would be considered a kind of scientific inscription, or I guess in that case a kind of anti-scientific inscription, but it's still part of the same large debate, right? Second, we talk about discourse not only expresses but shapes emerging knowledge. Sure, scientific texts may bear a complex dialectical relationship to knowledge and practice, right? So the basic point here is that rhetoric is involved in the business of discovering, sharing, conversing, mediating knowledge, right? The knowledge that we have is rhetorically generated in the sense that it comes from all over the place and it's constantly being reworked, even science, right? So, the assumptions that are in science, the norms, the expectations. I'm just blown away by some of the norms and the presumptions that today are just getting completely tossed up. It's because of social media, yes, but it's also because of like institutional failure and like corruption and like the people in charge doing terrible things and greedy things and selfish things and rotten, corrupt things. And there's this kind of baby in the bathwater business going on, which is like we hate the people in charge, So therefore, we hate the thing that they represent as well. We hate the truths that they represent, because if we don't like them, then we don't like what they're saying, and we're kind of swinging this opposite direction of like everyone gets their truth, everyone gets to have their own reality and metaphysics and the whole bit, because we have these devices that allow us to kind of create the world that we want for ourselves. And maybe that's good, but it feels like it's a recipe for chaos at some point. In any case, this is where we're at, right? So if you want to know if science is rhetorical, just sort of get on the socials right now and look up any kind of health related or, experts recommend, but they're idiots and this is the way to do it. There's so much like bad information and misinformation and new information, and it's just like, okay, right? So we've kind of collectively said the scientists are full of crap. Now we are all the scientists. Elon Musk has this saying about we are the media, right? Which is like, as though that's a good thing. Every single human being the media, that's a good thing, because we all have perfect knowledge. We all went to journalism school. We all know how to do reporting. We all, like, so frustrating. Anyway, major approaches. There's 5 different ways, I think so, talking about rhetorical aspects of scientific discourse, and I'll try to wrap up quickly after that. The first one has to do with inducement. This is page 5, right? So one dimension is symbolic inducement. Scientists will use symbols, will use metaphors, will use stories, will use examples or whatever. So there's an element of trying to actually convince people of findings. Another one is this business. Second one is situatedness, right? Like we all inhabit a certain place and time, and the concerns of this place and time might not be the exact same concerns as that place and time, right? Things change always. So the very fact that you are coming at a question from a specific place means that you're not coming at it from any other place or time. So context always shapes the thing, the question, the pursuit. Situatedness makes it rhetorical. Third, address. There's audiences. There are audiences, other scientists maybe, or maybe politicians, right? There's always this question of like, is your scientific research being compromised by, I got a grant for $5 million to study drones, and oops, my research shows me that drones are terrible and they're only going to make our lives worse. But I don't want to tell that to the drone manufacturer, right? So partisan interest, influence, all that kind of stuff. Next page, scientific discourse presents itself as reason. This business of presents itself as, right? So that's a bit of it controversial, but you can talk about reasonableness as a style. Feels like a postmodern trick, right? It's like, oh, Mr. Science over there, Mr. Reasonable over there. Guess what? That's a style. You talking about cold, hard facts, that's a style choice, right? I'm fascinated by the realistic style, right? You go to think about movies. Think about some of the most realistic war movies, like the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. Everyone says how realistic that is. Well, guess what? That's great stylistic choices on behalf of Spielberg, right? So scientists are really good at being, you're dealing with a scientist in an action movie when the hot scientist, female scientist, is wearing glasses and a white lab coat, right? You're presenting as a scientist. The next one is this business of invented, right? So rhetoric is involved in the invention of science in terms of the kinds of questions, the kinds of interests. These are human beings who live in the world, who live and breathe the problems of the world, right? And then is off talking about the scientific article, right? The article, the essay, the journal publication. There's a hierarchy of scientific journals. If all of science was the perfect pursuit of what is, there wouldn't be a hierarchy of scientific journals. There would be like one science journal, and everyone who published there would have perfect findings that we would read and we would say, okay, great, thank you, we're done. Never have to visit that one again, right? Science is messy because it's human, because it's fallible. We're constantly missing things. We're interpreting, we're misinterpreting. It's all rhetoric. Science as argument and persuasion, that's kind of the stuff that Ceccarelli talks about, right? How it is that scientists come into the public square and how they present their findings, right? You can't just assume that because you're the expert and know everything about the subject matter, that all you have to do is, here's my findings, right? You've got to translate. You've got to help the public understand better. So to the extent that we had failures during the pandemic, it was probably about translation. It's about trying to calm. It's about trying to assure. It's kind of a thankless job when you have that many people that freaked out, that frustrated. Pretty much everyone's going to be upset about something, right? And so my heart goes out, my sympathies go out to anyone in this kind of a role, because you're just trying to do the thing you love and know very well, and you're dealing with all this like discord and so on. In any case, hopefully by now you understand many of the different ways that science is rhetorical. The anti-foundationalist rhetorics of science, I'm not going to go into that. That's Ornatowski kind of acknowledging that more extreme view of the sophistic view, essentially, which says that all of science is just, again, appearances, storytelling. These are fantasies. Even if we have like reliable cause and effect data over and over again, that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about actual reality. It's just a quirk of our instruments being, maybe we've hit on something. Maybe we've actually hit on something real, but we're not actually getting reality itself. We're just kind of conjuring images and stories and reassuring ourselves. But, I'm not going there. I'm not going to say that everything is just a rhetorical story. I believe that there's a reality out there, and I believe that there are, hard truths wired in there, and that science actually does get at those things, but everything's always changing all the time, right? And so the truths themselves could evolve, our ability to understand it can evolve. The other thing that sort of proves that science is rhetorical is just think about, think about the representation of scientists in films. And there was something in here, I think it was in the Ceccarelli piece, about the kind of the scientist as cultural hero, right? Like you go back a few decades and you see scientists in movies or doctors, and they're just these infallible creatures, but they do make mistakes. And I think what's going on here in terms of the postmodern reaction to science is to say, okay, great, science, you're wonderful, but you're too arrogant. All you scientists are too arrogant. All you technicians are too arrogant because you've gotten us into mess after mess after mess, even though you might think that you're doing it for the right reason, right? If you watch that Oppenheimer movie, it's kind of all about like, well, here's these scientists who just love science, but then they end up creating something horrible. And we all get to look at them and go, hey, what's up, man? Like, just because you know all this factual truth or whatever doesn't mean that, like, you get off scot-free. There's consequences. There's things that we do with these insights. We all need to kind of share in this. So anyway, there's so much more that we could talk about here, but we just want to kind of hit on some of the ways that rhetoric and science, collide. I think what's going on is we had a couple hundred years of the modern approach where science controlled everything, and it didn't end so great. We had all kinds of bad outcomes and cold, inhuman kinds of approaches to problems, and now we're kind of swinging in the opposite kind of postmodern direction, which is there is no scientific truth. Everything is up for grabs, and we're seeing that playing out on social media. The earth is flat, raw meat, blah, blah, raw milk, blah, 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 blah. Well, here we are now. We've swung completely away from the scientist knows everything to screw the scientist. I have my own data, So we will see where things go. I'm a happy middle guy, so I hope that we can get some sanity and if we've gone too far in this direction, let's correct, but let's not overcorrect. We're always overcorrecting one way or the other way. So anyway, there's a little bit on the rhetoric of science. Do check out the Ceccarelli stuff, and we will proceed further discussion about postmodernism next. Thanks again.